In a quiet little neighborhood tucked away between rolling green hills and perfectly trimmed lawns, life was as peaceful as it could get. The streets were lined with houses that looked like they'd been plucked straight out of a postcard. White, picket fences, flower beds bursting with color, and shiny cars parked neatly in driveways. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other across the street, kids played outside until sunset, and everyone seemed to know one another by name. One family that recently moved into this idyllic community was the Carters. They weren't flashy or overly wealthy, but they had built a cozy life together. The dad, a tough yet gentle man who went by the nickname Coach, spent his days training some of the toughest soldiers in the world. He used to be part of an elite military unit himself, but now he worked behind the scenes teaching advanced skills like tracking, survival, and tactical operations to Green Berets. His work took him all over the country, but whenever he came home, he left that world behind and focused on his family. The mom, a soft-spoken woman with a warm smile, taught second grade at the local elementary school. She loved her job because it gave her a chance to shape young minds while still being close enough to care for her own child. Their daughter, a bright-eyed preteen full of energy, was the glue that held their little family together. She loved riding her bike through the winding streets of their new neighborhood, exploring every corner and making friends wherever she went. When the Carters first drove into Willow Creek Estates, a gated community known for its strict rules about keeping things neat and orderly, they felt like they'd hit the jackpot. It wasn't just the beautiful homes or the sense of safety. It was the idea of starting fresh in a place where everything seemed so perfect. But Coach, as much as he appreciated the calm, couldn't shake off a nagging feeling deep down. After years of dealing with authority figures who sometimes crossed ethical lines, he didn't trust systems that claimed too much power. He joked once, sitting on the porch with his wife, that the HOA enforcers patrolling the streets looked more serious than some of the soldiers he trained. For a while, though, nothing happened to prove him right. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The morning started early with coffee brewing in the kitchen and the sound of birds chirping outside. School days meant packing lunches, dropping off their daughter, and waving goodbye as she pedaled off on her bike. Evenings were filled with laughter around the dinner table, stories from work, and plans for weekend adventures. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. Then, one sunny Saturday afternoon, everything changed. It was one of those lazy days, when the air felt warm and heavy, and time seemed to stretch endlessly. Their daughter decided to ride her bike down to the entrance gate, just to see if any of her new friends were hanging out there. She promised she'd stay nearby and be back before lunch. Her parents didn't think twice about letting her go. It was a safe neighborhood after all, but what happened next would turn their world upside down. As their daughter cruised along the sidewalk near the gate, two men dressed in uniforms approached her. At first glance, they looked official, dark shirts, badges clipped to their belts, and stern expressions that made them seem like they were in charge. One of them stepped forward, blocking her path, and told her she was breaking a rule. According to them, there was a new curfew policy that prohibited kids from being outside unsupervised before noon. Confused and a little scared, she tried to explain that she hadn't heard about any such rule. But before she could say much, the men grabbed her bike and started leading her toward an unmarked van parked nearby. She called out for help, her voice trembling, but no one else was around to hear. By the time her mom realized something was wrong and rushed outside, it was already too late. The van sped off, leaving behind only tire marks and a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Panic set in quickly. Calls to the local police station yielded frustrating results. Officers listened politely but shrugged it off, saying it sounded like a civil matter under the jurisdiction of the HOA board. Frustrated and desperate, the mom turned to her husband, hoping he'd have answers. When he got home later that evening and heard the story, his jaw tightened and his eyes darkened with anger. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a harmless mix-up. Something was very, very wrong. What followed was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, confusion, and determination. The dad knew better than anyone how dangerous unchecked power could be. And now, With his own child missing, he wasn't going to sit back and wait for someone else to fix things. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test everything he believed in and push him to use every skill he'd ever learned to bring his daughter back safely. The dad came home late that evening, his boots dusty from a long day of training soldiers out in the field. He walked through the door expecting the usual calm, the smell of dinner lingering in the air, maybe the sound of the TV or his daughter, laughing about something silly. Instead, he found his wife pacing back and forth in the living room, clutching her phone like it might suddenly ring with good news. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "What's going on?" he asked, dropping his bag by the door. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like he already knew this wasn't going to be easy. She turned to him, her hands trembling as she tried to explain. "They took her," she said, her voice breaking. "Two men in uniforms. They said she broke some rule about being outside before noon. They took her." For a moment, the dad stood frozen, his mind racing. He felt like someone had punched him in the gut. His daughter? Taken? By who? And why? None of it made sense. But one thing was clear. Whoever these people were, they weren't playing games. "Did you call the police?" he asked, his tone sharp now, urgent. "I did," she replied, shaking her head. "They said it's not their problem. Something about the HOA having its own rules. Like that excuse is kidnapping." The dad clenched his fists. Years of working with law enforcement and military personnel had taught him how systems worked and didn't work. This wasn't negligence. It was complicity. These so-called HOA cops were operating in a gray area where no one wanted to step in. That left it up to him. First, he needed answers. Sitting down at the kitchen table, he pulled out his laptop and started digging. The HOA website looked professional enough, listing all kinds of regulations about lawn care, parking restrictions, and noise levels. But when he searched for information about their security team, things got murky. There were no names, no photos, no contact details, just vague references to authorized personnel enforcing the rules. Something about it felt off. Way off. Next, he called a few neighbors, trying to piece together what they knew. Most of them seemed uneasy talking about it, as if they were afraid of retaliation. One elderly woman admitted she'd seen those same men patrolling the streets lately, always in pairs, always wearing uniforms. Another neighbor mentioned hearing rumors about fines being issued for minor infractions, things like leaving trash cans out overnight or planting flowers in the wrong color scheme. It sounded ridiculous, but also sinister. Who gave these people the right to act like they owned the place? By midnight, the dad had pieced together enough to know this wasn't just a case of overzealous rule enforcement. These guys weren't legitimate officers. They weren't even licensed security guards. They were imposters, pretending to have authority they didn't deserve. And they had taken his daughter. His blood boiled. Every instinct told him to storm into the HOA office first thing in the morning and demand answers. But he knew better. Acting impulsively wouldn't help anyone. It would only put his daughter in more danger. If he wanted to bring her home safely, he needed a plan. A smart one. That's when he reached out to his network. Over the years, he'd built connections with people who specialized in tracking down bad actors, private investigators, ex-military, buddies, even cyber experts capable of hacking into databases most people didn't even know existed. Within hours, messages were flying back and forth, plans taking shape. One friend sent him satellite images of the neighborhood, highlighting areas where suspicious activity had been reported recently. Another shared intel on similar cases involving fake security teams targeting suburban communities. Slowly but surely, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just about enforcing petty rules. This was bigger. Much bigger. As dawn broke, the dad sat alone in his study, staring at the screen. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, fear, and determination. For the first time in years, he felt like he was back in the field, preparing for a mission. Only this time, it wasn't about protecting strangers halfway across the world. This time, It was personal. He thought about his daughter. Her laugh, her curiosity, the way she lit up a room just by walking into it. She didn't deserve this. No kid did. Whoever these people were, whatever game they were playing, they had picked the wrong family to mess with. With a deep breath, he grabbed his phone and dialed another number. This one belonged to an old comrade in arms, someone who owed him a favor. When the call connected, he got straight to the point. "I need your help," he said, his voice low but firm. "My daughter's been taken. I'm going to find her. And I'm going to make sure these bastards pay for what they've done." On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Then a gruff reply. "You've got it. Whatever you need." Hanging up, the dad allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. With his team assembled and his resolve stronger than ever, he began mapping out his next move. Somewhere out there, his daughter was waiting for him. And nothing, not fake uniforms, not corrupt systems, not even fear itself, was going to stop him from bringing her home. The dad knew time was running out. Every second his daughter was missing felt like an eternity, but he couldn't afford to rush blindly into this. He had to think clearly, act strategically. This wasn't just about finding her, it was about making sure she came back safe and sound. And that meant gathering as much information as possible before taking any risks. He started by retracing the steps of what happened earlier that day. The neighbor who saw the unmarked van speeding away mentioned it headed east, toward the outskirts of town where warehouses and industrial buildings stood abandoned. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. With his team spread across different parts of the country, they worked together remotely, pooling resources and expertise. One buddy hacked into traffic cameras along the suspected route, piecing together grainy footage that showed the van turning onto a desolate road lined with overgrown weeds and rusted chain-link fences. Another friend tapped into social media groups for local residents, searching for anyone else who might have spotted something unusual lately. Meanwhile, the dad decided to take matters into his own hands. Late at night, when most people were asleep, he grabbed a pair of binoculars, a flashlight, and his trusty GPS device, then drove silently toward the area flagged in the surveillance footage. He parked far enough away not to draw attention and crept through the shadows, keeping low and moving carefully between trees and bushes. His military training kicked in automatically, every step deliberate, every breath controlled. He scanned the horizon, looking for anything out of place. Flickering lights, strange noises, or vehicles parked where they shouldn't be. It didn't take long to find something unsettling. About half a mile down the road, tucked behind a row of dilapidated warehouses, sat an old brick building surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. At first glance, it looked deserted, but closer inspection revealed faint traces of activity. A security camera mounted above the gate, tire, tracks leading in and out, and what appeared to be fresh footprints near the entrance. Whoever was inside clearly didn't want visitors. The dad crouched behind a cluster of shrubs, studying the layout. There were 2 guards patrolling the perimeter, both armed and wearing uniforms similar to the ones described by witnesses. They moved methodically, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they checked every corner of the property. It was clear this wasn't some random operation. They were organized, disciplined, and dangerous, but the dad wasn't about to let fear stop him. He pulled out his phone and snapped photos of the scene, sending them to his team for analysis. Within minutes, his contacts confirmed his suspicions. The warehouse wasn't listed under any legitimate business records. In fact, the entire block had been condemned years ago due to structural issues. Yet here it was, humming with activity, in the dead of night. As he watched, another van pulled up to the gate, its headlights briefly illuminating the area before dimming again. 2 men stepped out, exchanged words with the guards, and disappeared inside. Something about the exchange caught the dad's eye. It wasn't just casual conversation. There was tension, urgency, even secrecy in the way they spoke. Whatever was happening inside those walls, it wasn't good. The next morning, the dad gathered his team for a virtual meeting. Using the intel he'd collected overnight, they mapped out the compound in detail, identifying potential entry points, blind spots, and escape routes. Each member of the group brought something unique to the table. One specialized in surveillance technology, another in explosives, and yet another in hand-to-hand combat. Together, they formed a tight-knit unit capable of pulling off even the toughest missions. "We're going in," the dad announced firmly. "But we do it smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Our priority is getting her, and anyone else trapped in there, out safely." His teammates nodded in agreement. They all understood the stakes. This wasn't just about rescuing one girl. It was about shutting down an operation that preyed on innocent families. If they succeeded, they'd save countless others from suffering the same fate. That night, under the cover of darkness, the team assembled near the warehouse. Dressed in black tactical gear and armed with non-lethal weapons designed to incapacitate rather than kill, they moved like ghosts through the empty streets. The dad led the charge, his heart pounding but his mind razor-sharp. As they approached the compound, he signaled for silence, holding up 3 fingers to indicate the countdown. 3, 2, 1. With precision timing, they breached the perimeter, disabling the security cameras and slipping past the guards without alerting them. Inside, the air smelled musty, the hallways dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. The sound of muffled voices echoed down the corridors, guiding them deeper into the labyrinthine structure. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door secured with a keypad lock. The tech expert on the team quickly got to work, bypassing the system within seconds. When the door swung open, the sight that greeted them stopped them cold. Inside were rows of makeshift cells, cages really, with children huddled together, in fear. Some clung to each other, wide-eyed and trembling, while others stared blankly at the floor, too traumatized to react. Among them was his daughter, sitting quietly in the corner, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as the light spilled into the room, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, the dad froze, overwhelmed by emotion. Then, snapping back to reality, he rushed forward, wrapping his arms around her tightly. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice thick with relief. "You're safe now." Behind him, the rest of the team began securing the area, checking for additional threats and ensuring everyone could be evacuated safely. The kids were confused, scared, and exhausted, but they followed instructions without question, clinging to the hope that rescue had finally arrived. As they prepared to leave, however, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. Without hesitation, the dad turned to his team, his expression grim but resolute. "Let's finish this," he said, gripping his weapon tightly. As the sound of footsteps grew louder, the dad's instincts kicked in. He signaled for his team to take positions, their movements quick and silent. The kids huddled together behind them, clutching each other tightly, their eyes wide with fear. His daughter stayed close to him, her small hand gripping his sleeve like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then the handle turned slowly, creaking as if to announce its presence. The dad tightened his grip on his weapon, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't the first time he'd faced danger head-on, but this time felt different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The door swung open, and 2 armed guards stepped inside, their flashlights sweeping across the room. They froze when they saw the scene before them. Half a dozen strangers dressed in tactical gear standing between them and the cages full of terrified children. One of the guards muttered something under his breath, raising his weapon instinctively. But before he could react further, the dad's team sprang into action. It all happened so fast it was almost a blur. A flashbang went off, filling the room with blinding light and deafening noise. The guards stumbled backward, disoriented, giving the team just enough time to disarm them without causing serious harm. Within seconds, both men were on the ground, zip-tied and unable to move. The dad glanced at his teammates, silently communicating that they needed to keep moving. There was no telling how many more people were stationed in the building, or whether reinforcements were already on the way. "Stay close," he whispered to the kids, ushering them toward the exit. Some of the younger ones started crying softly, overwhelmed by everything happening around them. His daughter tugged at his arm, her voice trembling. "Dad, what's going on? Are we safe now?" He knelt down, looking her straight in the eye. "We're getting out of here, okay? Just stick with me and don't let go." She nodded, swallowing hard, and clung to him even tighter. The group moved quickly but carefully, retracing their steps back through the dimly lit hallways. Every corner felt like a potential ambush, every shadow a possible threat. The dad kept scanning ahead, his mind racing through contingencies. If they ran into more guards, they'd have to neutralize them fast. If alarms went off, they'd need to find another way out. And if anyone got hurt, especially one of the kids, he didn't know if he'd be able to forgive himself. They were halfway to the exit when the first alarm blared, piercing the quiet night air. Red lights began flashing overhead, casting an eerie glow over the corridors. Someone had discovered the incapacitated guards and sounded the alert. "Move faster," the dad barked, his tone sharp but controlled. The kids picked up their pace, some tripping over their own feet in their haste. His teammate at the rear scooped up a little boy who'd fallen, carrying him without missing a beat. Despite the chaos, the group stayed together, driven by sheer willpower and the promise of freedom. Just as they reached the main entrance, a burst of gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the compound. The dad spun around, shielding his daughter with his body. "Keep going," he shouted to his team. "Get them out of here." One of his teammates hesitated, torn between following orders and staying to help, but the dad gave him a firm nod, his expression leaving no room for argument. "Go, I'll cover you." With a reluctant glance over his shoulder, the teammate led the group outside, disappearing into the darkness. Meanwhile, the dad turned back toward the gunfire, knowing he couldn't leave until he made sure the path was clear. He wasn't reckless. He knew better than to charge blindly into danger, but he also knew someone had to buy the others enough time to escape. He moved cautiously, using the shadows to his advantage. Around the next corner, he spotted 3 more guards rushing toward the commotion, their weapons drawn. They hadn't seen him yet. Taking a deep breath, he set off another distraction, a smoke bomb this time, sending thick clouds, billowing, through the hallway. As the guards coughed and stumbled, trying to regain their bearings, he slipped past them unnoticed. By the time he reached the exit, the rest of the team was waiting anxiously outside, the kids gathered safely behind them. Relief washed over their faces when they saw him emerge, though the tension in the air remained palpable. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was coming, and they weren't going to be happy about what had just happened. "We need to go. Now," the dad said, his voice low but urgent. Without wasting another moment, the group piled into the vehicles they'd parked nearby. The engines roared to life, tires squealing as they sped away from the warehouse, leaving behind a scene of chaos and confusion. As they drove, the dad glanced in the rearview mirror, watching his daughter sitting quietly beside her mom. She looked exhausted, her face pale but calm now that she was finally safe. He reached back, squeezing her hand gently. "You did great, kiddo," he said, his voice softening. "We're almost home." But the relief was short-lived. Even as they put distance between themselves and the warehouse, the reality of what they'd uncovered weighed heavily on everyone's minds. This wasn't just about rescuing a handful of kids, it was about exposing a network of criminals who thought they could operate above the law. The dad knew their fight was far from over. Backseat. At their house, the family regrouped, piecing together everything they'd learned. The dad called his contacts again, sharing evidence they'd gathered during the raid. Photos of the makeshift cells, documents linking key players to larger trafficking rings, and detailed accounts from the rescued children. By morning, federal authorities were involved, launching a full-scale investigation into the operation. News of the rescue spread quickly, sparking outrage among residents of Willow Creek Estates and beyond. People began sharing stories of intimidation and harassment by the fake HOA patrols, realizing they weren't alone. Lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation to crack down on predatory practices disguised as community governance. For the dad, the ordeal reinforced everything he believed in: justice, resilience, and the power of standing up to those who abuse their authority. And for his daughter, it became a lesson in courage and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there are people willing to fight for what's right. Though the scars of that night would linger, the Carters emerged stronger, united by love and determination. Their story served as a beacon of hope for others, proving that no matter how daunting the odds, ordinary people can rise up to confront extraordinary evil. The days that followed the rescue felt like a whirlwind. The dad, his wife, and their daughter were safe at home, but the weight of what they'd been through still hung heavy in the air. Every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door, they jumped, their nerves stretched thin. But even in the midst of all the chaos, there was a sense of purpose, a shared understanding that they couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what they went through. The first step was turning over everything they'd gathered during the raid to federal investigators. The dad sat down with agents from multiple agencies, FBI, Homeland Security, even local law enforcement, and walked them through every detail. He showed them the photos of the warehouse, the documents linking it to larger trafficking networks, and the testimonies from the kids who'd been rescued. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of an operation far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. At first, some of the investigators seemed skeptical. How could something like this happen right under everyone's noses? But, as the dad laid out the facts, connecting dots they hadn't seen before, their skepticism turned into determination. They realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a web of corruption stretching across state lines. Arrest warrants were issued, raids planned, and within weeks, key players in the scheme were rounded up. One by one, the masterminds behind the fake HOA patrols began to fall. News of the investigation broke nationwide, sparking outrage and disbelief. Reporters flocked to Willow Creek Estates, interviewing residents and digging into the history of the development. Stories poured out, tales of harassment, intimidation, and extortion disguised as community rules. Some families admitted they'd paid exorbitant fines for minor infractions, while others revealed how they'd lived in fear of retaliation if they spoke up. It became painfully clear that the Carters weren't alone. Countless people had suffered, silently, too scared to challenge the system. Amidst the media frenzy, the dad found himself thrust into the spotlight. He didn't seek attention. In fact, he preferred staying behind the scenes, but he understood the importance of using his platform to raise awareness. So he agreed to sit down for interviews, sharing his story not just as a father desperate to save his child, but as someone committed to exposing the dangers of unchecked power. His message was simple yet powerful. If something feels wrong, speak up. Don't wait until it's too late. His words resonated deeply, especially with parents who heard echoes of their own fears in his story. Schools invited him to give talks, community groups asked him to lead discussions, and advocacy organizations sought his input on policy changes. Slowly but surely, his efforts began to make an impact. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at regulating homeowners associations, ensuring transparency and accountability. Training programs were developed to educate residents on their rights and how to report suspicious activity. And perhaps most importantly, communities started coming together, refusing to let fear divide them any longer. For the daughter, the experience left both scars and lessons. At first, she struggled to adjust to normal life again. Nightmares woke her up in the middle of the night, and loud noises made her flinch. But with the support of her family and a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery, she slowly began to heal. She also discovered a newfound passion for helping others. Inspired by her dad's bravery, she decided she wanted to dedicate her life to social justice, to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Whether it was volunteering at shelters, organizing fundraisers, or simply lending an ear to friends going through tough times, she threw herself into making a difference. Her mom, too, found strength she never knew she had. Before the ordeal, she'd always considered herself the quieter, gentler half of the family. the one who kept things running smoothly behind the scenes. But now she refused to stay silent when something seemed off. She joined local committees, focused on reforming neighborhood governance, advocating for policies that prioritized fairness and compassion over control. Her voice carried weight because she spoke from personal experience, reminding others that change starts with standing up, even when it's hard. As for the dad, he returned to his work training Green Berets, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Teaching advanced tracking and tactical operations had always been rewarding, but now it felt like more than just a job. It was preparation for soldiers heading into combat zones, yes, but also for everyday citizens facing battles closer to home. He incorporated lessons from his own experience into his teachings, emphasizing the importance of critical thinking, teamwork, and moral courage. His students respected him not just for his skills, but for the example he set. Life in Willow Creek. Estates eventually settled back into a rhythm, though it was different from before. The gates remained, the streets stayed clean, and the flowers continued to bloom. But there was a shift in the atmosphere, a sense of empowerment rather than oppression. Residents took pride in their community again, knowing they had the tools to hold leaders accountable. Kids rode their bikes freely, laughter echoed through the parks, and neighbors greeted each other warmly, united by the knowledge that they'd stood together against injustice. Looking back, the dad often thought about how close they'd come to losing everything. There were moments during the rescue mission when he wondered if he'd made the right call, if risking his life and the lives of his team had been worth it. But then he'd look at his daughter sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, or hear her giggling with friends outside, and he'd know the answer. Yes, it had been worth it, not just for her, but for every child who deserved to grow up safe and free. In the end, the Carters' story wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, about choosing to fight back instead of giving in, about finding light in the darkest places and holding on to hope, even when the odds seemed impossible. And though the scars of that night would always remain, so would the lessons they learned. That courage can overcome fear, that love can conquer evil, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they stand together.